During this recorded lecture, we're going to talk about the cardiovascular and pulmonary changes that take place with aerobic training. At this point, we've already talked about the physiology, we've talked about the acute changes, the immediate changes that happen, we've talked about how to monitor these changes, but this lecture is focused on what happens after you complete 6, 8, 12 weeks of training, doing aerobic training. Now we're going to be talking about very specifically aerobic training follow the ACSM guidelines, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. We're not going to get into differences that might take place with high-intensity training or circuit training. We're combining resistance and aerobic training. We're just going to focus on the aerobic changes during this lecture, this talk. These are the objectives. What we'll be talking about, the idea of physical stress. We're talking about the physical stress of exercise and activity on the cardiovascular and pulmonary system. Okay, we'll talk about all those objectives too. So let's first off talk about, we've defined this already, but what we're talking about when it comes to fitness is how well we can bring oxygen in, how well we can use that oxygen, and how well we can create ATP to then create movement and motion. And this is just not one system. It's the cardiovascular, pulmonary, musculoskeletal, vascular system, neuromuscular system, all these systems working together to create movement and motion. We talked about this as classified through VO2 max, and we've talked about this in our exercise testing lecture in our labs, but remember, VO2 equals stroke volume times heart rate, which again, you know that's cardiac output, times the arterial minus the venous O2 difference. So that tells us how much oxygen, how much blood we're pumping per minute, how much oxygen is in that blood, and then how much oxygen is in the venous blood, and the difference tells us how much we've extracted and used for energy. And we can use all these different metrics to measure it. What determines fitness level? We've talked about all these things previously, but they're in here for your reference. Understand too that there are some differences, male versus female. You see, because of muscle mass levels and lung sizes and blood volumes, men typically have a little bit of a higher VO2 max than females. Point out too that even if you do lots of training, lots of exercise, your VO2 max does decline as the years go on. That rate can be higher if you're inactive. That can be less of a rate if you're more active. When we talk about aerobic training, as I mentioned before, we're going to talk about the ACSM guidelines and recommendations on aerobic training. And you see them all listed here. And the mode can be anything. That's as long as it's multiple muscle groups, and the key when we're prescribing this is that it's an enjoyable activity. Intensity, we're going to talk a little bit more in our exercise prescription lecture about how we set this intensity, but this is basically the 40 to 85% of the heart rate reserve. We'll talk all about that later. Duration, 20 to 60 minutes. Frequency, multiple days a week. Let's talk about kind of the overall effect. If we look at 12 weeks of training, what do we see happen system-wide? First of all, we see improvement in maximum oxygen uptake. Our efficiency is better, our submax levels are better, and we can tolerate longer loads. So let's jump into that a little bit more. Before we do that, though, also remember this idea that the Fick equation, we talked about that before, the changes in the Fick equation that might happen through training. So let's say we do our 8 to 12 week training program. What do we expect to see happen through this aerobic training? Anywhere from a 10 to 30% improvement in training over those 8 to 12 weeks. This is assuming the person is somewhat sedentary or it's a new activity for the person. As we talked about, we could have elite athletes, if they make a 0.5 to a 1.0 increase, that's the difference between a big contract or a gold medal or going home with nothing. If we talk about someone who's completely sedentary doing nothing, they might make a greater than a 50% improvement because they had such a big adaptation window for those improvements. The changes that happen to allow this improvement in VO2 max happen on two different levels. One, they happen centrally, that we think about the heart and the lungs, and then periphery, we think about the vasculature and the muscle changes that take place. What influences the level of the adaptations that take place? The dosage, the intensity, the minutes, the frequency, all those things like that. The specificity of training. When we talk about improvements, and we could talk about, running versus we could do, biking to aerobic training activities. We go through, do 8 weeks of training. Both of these are going to make changes take place in the heart, more those central adaptations. But if we do 8 weeks of running, our peripheral changes are going to be specific to running. Then if we retest ourselves and look at improvements in biking, yes, we'll see some improvements in biking, but during that training, all of our peripheral changes were specific to the activities and the motions of running. So the specificity of how we train and test is going to determine how the changes come across pre and post test. We've talked about pre-training and adaptation window. We've talked about gender, age, medical status too. So if your heart and lungs are not focused, are not working correctly, let's say you have COPD and you have your hyperinflated lungs and you have your flattened diaphragm, that's really going to influence your ability to do aerobic activity and lead to improvements in your overall VO2 max. So let's look at this. What kind of changes do we expect in VO2 pre and post training? So if we think about this being the workload down here, so workload, and this can be stages of an exercise test if we think about it that way, and this being our VO2 over here, and then we think about what happens. So we do the stages, and let's say this is pre-training here, we hit a point and we level out, okay, and this is our VO2 max because we see that leveling out. Now that's in contrast to post-testing. So we do post-testing. What might happen to be a slightly lower VO2 at each stage, but the VO2 should be very similar to what it was before. Sometimes the person's a little bit more efficient and their VO2 drops just ever so slightly at each of those stages. But as we go out, we take it out, 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 we go a couple more stages, maybe a little bit further, and then we see a leveling out of the new VO2 max. So what we can see is that post-training, the person goes a little bit further, higher workload, higher VO2 before it levels out. The other thing that happens is there would be a change in your work capacity, your ability to do submaximal activity. So with this concept, you think about this is relative to your VO2 max, 100% right here. This is your maximum capacity. And we think about how long can we do that, and you think about a line kind of coming down this way. If we're working at 100% of our VO2 max, we really can't do too much for too long. As we go down to different levels, we hit a point that maybe we come across like this. Okay, so when we're working at 75% of our VO2 max, we may be only be able to do that for an hour or two. What we find is that if you're around, about a third of your VO2 max, maybe up to 40% of your VO2 max, you can pretty much do that activity indefinitely. You might have muscle fatigue, those sort of things, but from a cardiovascular, pulmonary level, you can do those activities for a pretty long time at that 33 to 40% of your VO2 max. Think about the implications of that. This is somebody who pre-training, let's say their VO2 max was 8 METs, okay? So everything down here, they can go for a walk, they can go dancing, no problems at all. They can do that activity. These activities here, they can do the activities, but they can't do them for a very long duration. So if they're cutting the grass, they may have to stop and rest occasionally because of that. They might be able to carry in some groceries over a few minutes, but they're probably going to be tired and fatigued afterwards. And then these people up here, these are things that they might be able to do really, really short bouts using their anaerobic system, but they're not going to be able to do it for a long duration at all. Then you look at these people post-training. What you see now, the person's VO2 max is up to 10 METs. Okay, so they're at a 10 MET level. Now they could run for 7 miles per hour. That's their VO2 max, as you see. But the mowing lawn, they can do that for a much longer time. It's in the green zone. The groceries are going to be easier to do. These things will be easier. Still can't do these things, but there's definitely some improvements that they see. So now let's get into what allows these changes to happen. So we've talked about kind of this overall change we see in VO2 max, this overall improvement of efficiency in how we can do activities. Now we're going to break it down and talk about these different areas that we can see improvements in. One of the first things we see improvements in is blood volume. what happens? You start exercising, you start doing activities, blood volume goes up. And you think about this is a very easy thing to change. It doesn't involve laying down muscle, it doesn't involve growing vessels. All our body does is it goes through and it senses an increase in activity. We have aldosterone released, we have some other things that take place in our kidneys that involve us to retain fluids, and it's in a positive way. So we have more blood in our system, and this is a benefit because now there's more blood to pump, there's more blood to deliver. It puts more of a stretch on the heart during contraction of the ventricle, and think about that Frank Starling principle where you stretch the fibers more, you get a more forceful contraction. Also, with that increase in blood volume, you get an increase in red blood cells or hemoglobin. So benefits there too. And you see some of the benefits of this, right? I just talked about most of this. Improved circulatory reserve. Preload is probably one of the big ones, and that leads to the improvements in the stroke volume, which leads to improved oxygen transport. The one we don't always think about is temperature regulation. And if you've gone through and started a brand new exercise program, when you first do it, you might feel very short of breath, you might feel very sweaty, get hot, get overheated pretty easy. But as you become more efficient, it's partly your neurological system learning how to manage your temperature better, but it's also because you have more blood volume. You can dissipate that heat better. This is just a different way to look at it. You can see pre-post. We see our total blood volume from here to here has gone up. Our hematocrit, though, remember this is the percentage of red blood cells, has gone down a little bit. But the thing to point out is that the amount of red blood cells, or the hemoglobin, has gone up. As you see from this figure here, it's just a lower percentage of their blood. And if I were giving this lecture live, I would ask you, what's the benefits of that? Well, the benefits is this decreases the viscosity of your blood, or the thickness of your blood. And how do you think that would serve as a benefit for us? Well, hopefully you're thinking to yourself, it lowers your risk of stroke, makes the blood a little bit thinner, easier to pump. So there's benefits to having a little bit of a lower hemoglobin, a little bit higher blood volume. But the point is that your overall number of red blood cells goes up. Heart size. So we see the heart grow because of this short periods, 20, 30 minutes at a time, whatever it might be of activity. The heart goes through a hypertrophy stage. Blood volume, fibers go up. The ventricular size increase. This could be because the volume goes up, I should say. This is because of blood volume. Also because of increased blood volume, increased stroke volume, the heart rate goes down, and then the diastolic time is increasing. So you think about, this is your diastole, this is your systolic, diastole, systolic. If you're pumping more per beat, you don't need to pump as often. So what that leads to is a situation where it's more like diastolic, systolic, diastolic, systolic. Your time in diastole is bigger, allowing more time to fill and causing a bigger volume in the ventricles. I also want to point out that not all hypertrophy is the same, because we talk about hypertrophy in the pathology lecture and how that's a bad thing. Understand this idea of physical stress. Okay, so this idea we're exposed to different stressors and our body adapts. When we have periods of short stressors, like during aerobic training, our heart has time to recover, properly lay down those new fibers, go through the whole protein synthesis, all the different steps to laying down muscle and changing the things that happen during hypertrophy. But if we're in a disease state, what happens, it's a constant load. Okay, so we're constantly overstressed. The heart has no time to rest. The heart has no time to recover to allow those adaptations to take place. And also what happens is the heart becomes overstretched because of all this extra work it's doing. So not all hypertrophy is the same. Okay, so we've touched on this already, but we know that blood volume goes up, which puts more of a stretch on the heart. And what that leads to is an increase in your stroke volume. So stroke volume at rest goes up, stroke volume during maximal loads go up, and submaximal loads. This is because of more blood volume and longer diastolic filling time. And this causes to an improved contractility or stretch on the fibers. So we think about stroke volume. Look at this graph over here. So preload is going up, which is causing an increase in the end diastolic volume, which causes a more forceful contraction. Let's think about this from a graph standpoint. So we have our pre-training workload stroke volume. We kind of go up like this, and what happens is we see a little bit of a leveling off, and then what happens, as you see, with the stroke volume has a big immediate increase is what you see. So it immediately goes up, but eventually it levels off. So it's not very much of a linear increase in stroke volume. There's an early increase, and then it levels off. That's partly because heart rate's going up. The time for diastolic filling is going down because the heart rate's going up, and in a sense, you've maximized the venous return already. You can't get the blood back any faster to fill the heart at a faster rate. So we do see stroke volume kind of level off. It's one of those non-linear ones that we see happens. Now you know this already from the previous lecture that we had, but I just want to make that point clear to you. So what happens with training, though? Let's look at that. That's probably the more important issue that we're talking about today, is that we see stroke volume actually starts here at a higher level to begin with, right? Because of improvement in all those areas. It goes up, 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 and it goes longer before it levels off, and then it levels off. Okay? And we get to a higher workload because of that. But the big changes you see, a higher resting stroke volume, you have higher submaximal stroke volume, and then you have higher maximal stroke volumes post-training. Now let's talk about the changes that take place in the heart. What we find is there's a decrease at rest and submax levels, and this, I've touched on this already. This comes down to the issue of stroke volume. Because stroke volumes are higher, heart rates can be lower. No real change at maximal load. So we think about what we talked about earlier is that age predicted maximum heart rate, as we typically talk about 220 minus age, and that's an estimate, but you see there's no alteration in that equation based on fitness level or training level. This comes down to just the idea based on age alone. So maximal levels don't change post-training. Some studies might show a slight increase, but for the most part, not much of a change. The benefit I just said leads to longer diastolic filling time. Reasons for changes in heart rate, we talked about this. Stroke volume has gone up. The parasympathetic system increases the activity in the sympathetic system, decreases there. So parasympathetic goes up, sympathetic goes down. It's kind of like this egg or chicken debate. Which one leads to which? Is it the blood volume which causes the heart rate to go down, or is it the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system making changes, which then lowers the heart rate, which then allows the stroke volume to go up? End of the story. It doesn't really matter for us from a clinically applicable standpoint, is that heart rate goes down post-training at rest and submaximal levels. And this really is an efficiency and less work on the heart. So let's look at this as we go. So we have pre-training, our heart rate and workload, and that's going to come up this way. And of course we'll max out there, right? We'll hit a higher max and stop as we keep going. If we think about this from post-training, what are we going to see? Well, we're going to see a lower heart rate to begin with, right? So it's going to be down here. Lower heart rate at each stage. Probably going to go a little bit higher, a higher workload before we hit that level and we max out. And the heart rate, these are really close to each other. They should stay pretty much the same pre and post training. The difference is that a lower resting and lower heart rate at each workload if we were to repeat the exercise test. Think about how this plays out on the stress of the heart. Okay, so cardiac output is 5 liters, let's say at rest. Trained individual, heart may only beat 50 beats per minute, leads to a stroke volume of 100 milliliters. The untrained person, 70, smaller stroke volume, still 5 liters if we multiply this out. End up in the same spot, but who's expending less energy? Well, it's this trained individual expending less energy. The heart's beating less beats per minute, and I'll show you in a little bit later that their systolic pressure is down also, so that means the heart's expending less energy at rest also. Cardiac output, so this is the combination of stroke volume and heart rate. What we see is there's improvement in the maximal levels. The stroke volume accounts for most of those changes. So if you think about changes in stroke volume, pre and post training, it's the stroke volume change that leads to most of those improvements in cardiac output. We may see a little bit lower cardiac output at submaximal levels, and that's because just a better job of the peripheral extracting the oxygen and using the oxygen. So we may not need to deliver as much to do the same amount of work. For the most part, though, that's pretty slight. So how does it lead to changes in stroke volume? So again, this is kind of your pre-test. You're going to have it go up and, of course, kind of max out. And then your post-test is going to be very, very similar to this, where you kind of go along this way, this way, this way, this way, kind of a little bit higher, and then max out. And I'm noticing an error right now. This should actually be cardiac output on the y-axis. So you'll want to change that in your handout to make sure that's accurate. But the take-home point is that stroke volume at each stage is going to be similar. Cardiac output at each stage is going to be similar, but we'll just get to a higher level as we go. So these changes to the heart do lead to an overall efficiency, and I hinted at this earlier. So we can look at someone pre-training, pumping 10 liters of blood. Heart rate might be at 130, and systolic might be 150, and that leads to a rate pressure product of almost 20,000. So remember, that's the workload in the heart. Post-training, now to pump the same amount of blood, the heart rate's lower. Why is the heart rate lower? We know this by now. It's the stroke volume. The stroke volume's higher. We don't have to pump as much, so stroke volume is higher. Heart rate can be lower. The blood pressure is going to be a little bit lower. We'll talk about the reasons why that a little bit later. Rate pressure product is less, so less stress on the heart as we go. What's happening in the heart itself? So let's kind of jump to that myocardial blood flow. We actually grow some very small microvessels, and we have improved delivery of blood to the heart. So cross-sectional area, the coronary arteries go up, vascularization rechanges, and we do a better job of controlling blood flow. Okay, so our body works to be efficient first. It learns how to be more efficient, to vasodilate, to deliver where it needs to go before it goes through all these changes. So we see those benefits happening too. So being smarter, using what you got, and then trying to give yourself more things also. Our vascular system. So now let's go out to the more periphery, what's happening. We get more efficient delivery of blood through the vascular system, better distribution. So again, this is us using our neurological system better to learn how to do these things. These arterioles are getting signals about where to divert blood and where to send blood. But these are the things that take a little bit longer to do. Okay, so these are the early changes you might see, and then these are the later changes you might see. We actually grow new vessels to decrease the distance of diffusion, to increase the cross-sectional area, which leads to better oxygen delivery. Blood pressure, we see blood pressure drop at submaximal levels and then at rest also. Again, efficiency, our endothelium does a better job releasing nitric oxide. Our parasympathetic system is also a little bit lower. Our parasympathetic system is keeping that tone down in our vessels, just like it keeps the heart rate down, and this leads to some improvements in blood pressure. Muscles, this is where the specificity of training comes in. Remember, our type 1 muscle fibers are more oxidative, endurance, aerobic type of muscle fibers. Type 2 are more of our power, strength, anaerobic muscle fibers. If we're doing pure aerobic training, we're going to see the improvements in the type 1 muscle fibers. Might see some conversion to some of the type 2 muscle fibers to more aerobic qualities, but for the most part it's the type 1 muscle fibers that are changing. You won't see many changes in strength or power because we're not training for strength and power in these patients or these clients. So mostly aerobic training. Again, the idea is the specificity of training. What's happening in the muscles? Well, we mentioned before, capillary density is going up. So we think about what are those things that affect transfusion or diffusion of gas. It's area, it's distance, it's pressure. All these things affect it, and of course the solubility, but that doesn't play so much a role right here. But if we have a higher density of capillaries, it causes our area to go up, or cross-sectional area to go up. If there's more capillaries, there's less distance between the capillaries and the muscle fibers, and actually it increases the time for travel. There's more routes that the blood has to go through. The travel time goes up. So this leads to overall better exchange of gases, nutrients, as you see there. Other things that we have happened, we do a better job of creating ATP. So muscle cellular adaptations, so mitochondrial density improves, the size increases, we do a better job of getting lactate out of our muscles to decrease muscle soreness and those feelings of stress and anxiety when we exercise. Also, our myoglobin levels improve, so we do a better job of delivering oxygen to the mitochondria itself. Our muscles do a better job of extracting the oxygen. Okay, so remember, we have that oxygen delivered. At rest, the muscles only maybe extract like 20 to 30% of the oxygen from the blood. During exercise, though, our body learns how to extract that even more. Okay, so we do a better job of extracting that oxygen to use what's delivered to our benefit. Energy utilization, we use lipids better, so our body becomes better at breaking down the lipids. Remember, lipids have those 9 kilocalories per gram of fat, whereas carbohydrate is only 4 kilocalories. So if we can break down the molecule of lipid versus a molecule of fat or of carbohydrate, just be clear on that. If we can break down the lipid, we get more energy for that. Now, it takes more time to do that. It takes more energy to do that, but the payoff is better. And if we can use fat longer, we can wait to actually tap into our glycogen levels and our glucose in our blood and in our muscle. So this is a graph that tries to exhibit or display this a little bit more. So we have pre-training with the asterisk, we have post-training with the dollar sign. At rest, you see we're using a little bit more carbohydrate and fat. You see kind of that breakdown there, mostly fat. But you see after training, we're using more fat at rest. And then what happens as we go, you see that trend kind of continue, that the untrained or pre-training, they switch over to completely carbohydrate at this point, where the person that redoes the test 8 weeks later, 12 weeks later, post-testing, their RER may not be as high. So here, it might be 1.0, but now at this stage it might be 0.89. They haven't quite gotten there. Here, this might be their max. They're probably greater than the 1.0, but here they might be at 0.98. So they can use carbohydrate longer. They can use their fats longer before they have to switch over to carbohydrate, allowing them to get to a higher VO2 max. Blood lactate. Remember, we're always producing lactate as part of the energy creation process. So it builds up in our muscles, but at lower levels, we're able to extract it, get rid of it, take it out, process it, eventually create carbon dioxide and blow off that carbon dioxide. But we do hit a level, usually about 60 to 70% of your VO2 max, that you start seeing that lactate building up. Okay, so let's look at that a little bit. I don't have a dotted line drawer, but I think you'll be able to follow along with me. So we might think about this kind of being pre-training, and we eventually hit a point where that blood lactate level starts to go up. But then if we look at this post-training, you see the slightly lower levels at rest as we go, slightly lower levels. We can get to a little bit higher VO2 before we start having it accumulate and go up. So the take-home point is lower levels of lactate at rest. We can keep that levels of lactate low for a longer time or to a higher absolute intensity before it starts to accumulate and go up. Now let's switch over to the pulmonary system. Our pulmonary system has a very large reserve. So if I put you on a treadmill, ran you to your maximum amount, what we would find is that you still have probably about 20 to 30% of your pulmonary system's maximum capacity left before when you hit your VO2 max. That tells you that really your pulmonary system is typically not the weakest link in this whole oxygen transport system. Okay, so what we find is that training doesn't really have that much of an improvement in pulmonary function because the pulmonary system's not stressed to a level in which it has to adapt and make changes. Lung volumes are not unaltered. Small changes, maybe in minute ventilation, maybe some improvements in strength. There's some extraction, but overall we're not seeing these big improvements like we do in the cardiovascular system. Neurohumoral, I mentioned this earlier, but to make this point again, is that you see increased parasympathetic tone on the heart. So remember, the parasympathetic system keeps the tone high to keep the heart rate low at rest, and as you start exercising, you see that ramp goes down. But what happens post-training, you have a blunted catecholamine response. Also, you get so that helps keep your heart rate lower. So sympathetic systems less active, parasympathetic more active. We also have improvements in our immune system. There's whole lines of research looking at how exercise can benefit your immune system. Let's think about this when it comes to the disease process, though. So we'll touch on this idea that if you're more active, your risk of cardiovascular disease goes down, and also your risk of mortality goes down. So physical activity benefits you because of a lot of these changes that we've just talked about, but there's also changes in cholesterol levels, changes in glucose levels. Many of those risk factors we talk about are improved through extended physical activity. We spend a lot of time talking about the untrained individual and the benefits of training and why we need to train, but there is a small sector of people who overtrain. They do too much activity, and this actually leads to a decline in their performance. And this can be cardiorespiratory, cardiovascular, overtraining. We see this happening. That's what we'll talk mostly about, but understand also musculoskeletal overtraining, where that pitcher who throws too many pitches can damage their shoulder, that football player damages their knee, the volleyball player. We can go on and on with examples, but too much of one type of training can lead to detrimental effects in our body. And there's emotional side, so emotional exhaustion, but also physiological changes, and our body can enter more catabolic state because of this. Some of the things you might see, kind of these changes in mood, these are more type of the things that you see from a physiological standpoint. You might see performance go down also. That might be more psychological, but could also be physiological. But the vitals are some of the big things that you see change. Where those should be going down, they actually go up because you're in more of a catabolic, more of a sympathetic system activity. Now, I do want to take a moment and go through and talk to you about some of the training effects that might happen. What we see going on, and this is just one example, kind of an older study, but doesn't really change things necessarily. Look, they took people who did aerobic training, a group that did a yoga, and then a weight list. And these were older adults. You see what the aerobic training looked like, a pretty standard aerobic training improvement. What we see that the aerobic training group had improvements in all these different markers of health. Also, their VO2 max went up. So they had about 11% improvement, a 0.6% or a 0.6 MET improvement. And you might ask yourself, is that is it a clinically meaningful change? Well, if your MET level, your VO2 max was 4 or 5, and you got it up a little bit higher, yeah, that 0.6 means a lot. If it was 7 or 8, it means a lot. Now, if we're talking about someone who's very, very fit, going from a 12 to a 13, does that mean a lot? Or 12 to 12.6, it's an improvement for sure. It can mean different things to different people, but there was a significant change. You're learning about standard mean difference, okay? And what we see is at a 0.65 or 0.56 improvement there is what we see. The range does not include 0, so we do feel like this is a moderate improvement that we see. Another example, this is high intensity versus moderate intensity, and benefits of moderate intensity activity for sure. There's also benefits to higher intensity activity. So there's a little bit smaller groups. There's control, moderate, and high. First 3 months, they all did the same. The last 3 months, you see the high intensity went up to about 85%. What do we see? Well, both groups made improvements. So the take-home point with that is that you can do any type of activity and get benefits, but we see the high-intensity group had better benefits or better improvements. MET levels went higher, greater improvements, standard mean differences were a little bit higher. 95% confidence interval did include 0, probably because of the variability, given it as a little bit smaller group of subjects with only like 11 to 15 in each group, causes the variability to go up. But we do see some improvements for sure, some added benefits with high-intensity training. Other factors considered, don't forget about training schedules. We'll talk more about high-intensity interval training later, and circuit training. Resistance training can also play a role in some of these improvements and what we see happening. Nutritional supplements, diets, that could be a whole nother class talking about the impact of nutrition and supplementation. And application of training principles. Don't forget to apply those issues of overload and adaptation window and specificity. All those things factor in. So that is the end of our talk. We will build upon this when we talk about changes and the benefits of training for various populations. We'll build upon this talk this summer in DPT 800 Applied Anatomy and Physiology. We'll get in a little bit more of the details of the of the high intensity interval training, the circuit training, some of the different benefits you might see with that.